Folks, we're ready to start here at 7:10.
Make that, what's going to, maybe the, yep.
All right, we're going to call to order at 7:10 here. Apologize to everyone for some of the technical difficulties, but would like to welcome everyone to the February 26th regular meeting of the Burn Hills Boston Lake Board of Education. If you could please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I got the left. Pledge allegiance.
To the flag of the United States of America.
Which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
And as I think most of our guests probably know, we typically start by introducing ourselves. So we'll start down there with you, Dottie, if you don't mind.
Dottie Salvatore.
Christopher Abu. David Versaki.
Lisa Morse. Hannah Shaw.
Patrick Ziegler.
Patrick McGrath. John Antosky.
Don Marshall.
Peter Sawyer. Dave Collins.
Tara Mitchell.
Caitlin Brown. Susan Brennan. Elizabeth Page.
Brian Olefek.
Kathy Kimball.
Janice Pitkin.
Good to see you all here tonight. Although we do have our social studies program review tonight, I was asked to share a public service announcement. So I'll let everyone know, and here on camera as well for the public record, that we are hosting a blood drive in the gym on Tuesday, March 3rd from 3:30 to 7 o'clock p.m. It is being organized by our old friend Will Farmer's son, Alex. So if you have any questions, you can reach out to Alex. Although you're probably not going to be writing down his email address, farmeralex40@gmail.com. But more importantly, if you'd like to set an appointment, you can call the Red Cross, 1-800-RED-CROSS, or visit the website. Again, that's Tuesday, March 3rd from 3:30 to 7. And we thank Alex for hosting and organizing that event. So with that, I believe we are passing it over to Mr. John Antosky for our social studies program review.
Thank you, Mr. Ziegler. I am John Antosky. I am the K-12 coordinator for social studies for the district. And hopefully everybody got a chance to just take a quick view of the overview. I've got some aspects that I'd like to run over to be able to maybe give more information, and then if anybody's got any questions afterwards, I'm more than happy to answer them, or if I can't answer them immediately, I'll answer them once I find the information. So essentially, social studies, you could have a review every year and say to yourself, what's different in social studies? It's all history, and history really doesn't change. And there is some truth to that. I can tell you, if you read into this, there was 1996 was the last revision. They started a revision in 2014, in which the content, there was some information that would come out that the content changed, and there was no real content change. It was more of a focus on certain aspects of the content. And that's essentially when they talk, the English Common Core, I believe, had some more radical pieces. The math, there were some distinct differences. Social studies, it is not a dramatic shift, but it is a shift nonetheless, and you do need to address it, and that's basically what we've been doing and what I kind of wanted to overview here in this presentation. So I hit some basic points and start with that data that as you go into the next few pages. I've got data that goes back since I started in '02. I put the last 5 years on there for this focus this evening. As you can see, there isn't, or in some cases maybe people feel, and I can explain where I haven't seen anything real dramatic. There are some changes and shifts that occur over the years, and there's actually a lot of things involved why those shifts occur and why some of them, why there's a bubble here and then it'll drop again. But as I can tell with the staff, particularly at the high school, because it's the only measured test we have, or the two regions, that their approach to instruction, there isn't a dramatic change. We do change, and we address that, and we address some of the weaknesses when I take a look at the exams, but there isn't a dramatic shift that would coincide with any kind of changes that you might see. Sometimes they spike with students that fall below passing. And there are reasons for that. I analyze that exam. We take a look at some of the questions and some of the content that's on the exam. There's also, if you're not familiar with the exams, they have a grid in which they start working with percentages and statisticians that work these numbers. So we're basically using a cross chart that you can, in some cases, perform better in certain years, but the grades don't reflect that in the next years because of that grid. So I have data, we look at data, we use it to address things, but I can't say, and I think I stressed this at one point in the document, that we don't necessarily teach to the exam. We're not teaching an exam or exam prep. We're teaching the foundation, which is the content. So how that content is covered is what we run through here as I move down.
Now, John, when you talk about content, are you also
Yep.
talking about skills as part of that content?
Yes, yep, and sure, I'll get to that as well. I'm just pushing down through the experiences are, if you wanna, using some old terminology, it's field trips, it's experiences that the kids have. I've listed them out. I don't believe I've left anything out, but I know there's always things that go on, that the kids will, enjoy these particular experiences. We always get feedback from the students when they attend these things. And there was a question that was raised in regards to how we quantify that information, and that's a good question. We don't currently quantify, but that doesn't mean we can't. So we do get feedback, but we don't necessarily have a form or a checkbox type of thing. But
Some of it's hard to quantify.
yeah, it is. But overall, I've been on a lot of these myself. I experienced, I think, just about every one of these. I've been to just about every one. So the students do gain a different perspective than what you see in a classroom. So it's a valuable part.
And I think too, part of it is, we do a lot, in higher education around experiential learning. And I think that's why I really value these things, because these things can make a real difference, and pique student interest, get them
Oh, yeah.
excited about the curriculum. But part of it too is when we think about that, how can we get them to reflect on their experience? And if there's not that component, if they're not writing, what did you get out of this? Or if they're not thinking about that, you lose that. And I guess and I think that's part of it, because part of your assessment could always be a quick reflection piece. What
Right.
did you get out of the experience? And help students to realize that too. And
Right.
they're more likely to keep that learning.
And actually, when you mention that, I think about, in particular, that Gettysburg trip, when you got a 5-hour trip coming back. There is discussion there, I can tell you, at the nauseam of the impact of that particular one. But, it's usually verbal. There isn't any, not off the top of my head, I can say that doesn't mean that's not something we couldn't move into to actually quantify and get some more information. Moving down through, I tried to show an example of that content shift, and I used the example of World War I, and essentially the content is the same. The 2014 framework, for example, they don't stress the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. That doesn't mean teachers ignore it and say, well, because you can't ignore it. I'm using this example because part of this position that I'm in, I teach point 4, which is a valuable piece, because I experience some of these shifts and see how the kids react to it. So I know, for example, you can't cover World War I without the mention of the revolution and why the U.S. was involved in it in the first place. The older content had it as an issue where you could spend more time. So you don't just brush over it, but you don't spend as much time as you may have in the past. And it gets picked up again in global. There's a lot of repetitive pieces to it. So that shift, that's an example of the kind of shift you see. There isn't anything glaring that I have been made aware of, K through 12, where somebody's saying, well, how come it doesn't have this particular piece of content? because, and if it were, we would continue with it anyway, unless it were not something of relevance.
Hey, John?
Yep.
What was the rationale for something like that? I mean, you can't talk about the outcome of World War I without talking about what happened in Russia and the revolution and why there's changing government there. And not that I'm emotionally involved either way, but
Right.
I'm curious, even from a larger perspective, what that specific example points to in terms of the shift in thought and why they made such changes to the social studies curriculum.
I would assume that in some respects, in this particular example, it is, the Bolshevik Revolution will be covered in depth when they get into 10th grade. To maybe cover it in the 8th grade when US has a time span that you're supposed to get through, the idea may have been, you know, don't ignore it, but don't spend 2 weeks on it because they're gonna get it again. And in reality, World War I in 8th grade is the US perspective.
Got it.
But
Okay.
like you said, you can't, that's one of the US reasons was that revolution. So you can't ignore it, but
But
you
the
may have
focus is more as an Americanist in 8th grade,
Right.
and then you pick it up in as a global topic
global.
later.
And then even when you get into 11th grade, the US history continues and you cover US and you cover World War I again, but again, it's that American, the US perspective. So it's there, but it's not a,
Gotcha.
Is there a recency bias by any chance in how this material presented or the volume of the material presented?
as far as,
More current or recent history being more focused on, the say, within the lifetime of this generation. The
the,
Bolshevik Revolution being very important, but that was like 100 years ago.
that is correct. And
And it's gone
essentially,
already, didn't even last 50 years.
essentially the state will say,
The state,
New York State will say that the students are responsible in the New York State Regents through 9/11. That's from the US
Through
perspective,
9/11.
through 9/11. So, and unfortunately, you do see that, right now, as an 8th grade teacher, my class, we're finishing the Roaring Twenties. I know the other 2 teachers that are teaching 8th grade that do it continually, they're in World War II already. So I gotta get through the Depression and World War II. So there are some delays that occur depending on if you find some weaknesses. But as you move down through this, the shifts, essentially what you're looking at is, rather than probably what we're all used to in a social studies class in the past with some notes and some drill and kill and give them the content, and lesson plans were arranged in that way so that you gave that content. And now lessons need to be derived so that you make sure you're hitting some ELA standards, you're hitting the social studies skills. And essentially, a lot of the lessons, as we found, as we go through, the teachers are finding, they did it already. It's just a matter of quantifying that information. This lesson addresses this, this, and this. And that's, I just have we use the BOCES from Putnam and Westchester County, and the New Visions as kind of a guide. I know I personally, and hopefully this link, I don't think the link works for you guys, and it might not work for me now, but let's see if it goes there. It's not going to work. But essentially, if you go to the Westchester County, site that we have, yours did work?
Yeah.
So it's showing lessons. So essentially, those are teacher-driven lessons from numerous teachers from downstate that during the summer, they get their summer curriculum, they create these lessons, they put them in this general box, and people who, we pay a small amount and we have access to those lessons that are already aligned with that. And the beautiful thing is, and what I find our teachers do, is they access it, but they don't necessarily use it verbatim. So there are some, it's not a perfect system, but it is a nice base that, a younger teacher could use as a base. And even myself, I'm currently using one right now on documents that I'll discuss a little bit later, as far as how those documents are used. So there's an example, I gave a pretty, it's not a very good example, but you use some worksheet. It covers those areas of the reading, writing, the theme alignment, the practices, And that's what we've been doing as far as aligning our lessons, making sure that those things are being, because you may find that maybe we spend times on certain skills, but maybe we need to spend more time on, let's say, geography, and we find a shortage, or there's an issue with it, with an exam that's, so when you take a look at it this way, it does break it down in a better system for teachers to be able to see. The program opportunities that I went through, there's this little diagram that I have, and essentially this is the goals for this year for social studies, and it all revolves around the idea that the framework is there, we have content to cover, and there's variables that we need to get through as well. One of the key ones is the document analysis, and I believe we get through to, there's an example of this, something we're using at the elementary school, where when you analyze a document, oftentimes we'll look at one, and students in particular, maybe even adults, you look at a document, don't actually look at it. You're trying to figure out what it is, you haven't looked at the source, you haven't looked at all the various parts of it to see bias, to see different things. So this kind of runs you through a system. It's got a nice little meet the photo, observe the parts, so the kids get used to that at the elementary school in particular. We've got a HIPPO version, where that's the acronym for the middle school that seems to be a hit as well this year. But the idea is that the students take a look at the documents in a different perspective, a different way than they have in the past. And I've even noticed it, I'll go back to that lesson I'm using now, the students look at documents. The one I'm using now has data on the bottom and a picture on the top, and it's talking about prohibition, and it shows the data of people that are imprisoned during prohibition. And I'm trying to steer students to say prohibition was a failure because everybody went to prison. But the kids even today were saying, or yesterday, were saying, but you don't know why the prison rate, there could be murderers in there and it might not be associated with alcohol or anything. So kids see that now, and that I think is the key to the success that they'll have when they take the Regents, when they have the bigger exams later on, is to look at that document. And I see that at elementary and middle school, where you're kind of pushing the shoulders and helping them out. And the key is when they get to the high school, they have to be able to do that on their own. So that's the progression that they follow. So documents are really important. We're really taking a look at those elementary through, now it's all the way through.
And I think that's, like I mentioned today, that's so important, because there's that study they did of 8th graders, they couldn't tell the difference, even online sources, they can't tell sarcasm, got an agenda, or if it's real news. So I think more so than at any period, we have to understand where knowledge is coming from, what the bias is and all that. So that's
Correct.
great that you're doing that.
I've got some good stories on 8th graders as well, not seeing anything in the document that they should be seeing.
I think it's just 8th graders. You put that on Facebook actually as a good instructional video for adults. So
Yeah.
with their ability to evaluate what's real and what isn't.
So moving down, one of the aspects is enduring issues. That's a part of the Regents, and that's, I want us to be able, so that you can understand that the Regents are changing. They haven't technically changed for our students yet. There's been a transition Regents, and to go back, Global Regents used to be grade 9 and 10. They took it in 10th grade. They had 2 years of content. They had to write a thematic essay and a DBQ essay. Then we are in a transition stage since 2018 where they took out the 9th grade content. Student still takes it in 10th grade, so it's just 10th grade content. Still write the thematic, still write the DBQ. And as of August of this year, we have one more of those transitions this June that the kids will be taking. But in August, it is the new exam, which is less, you'll see in the document, there's less multiple choice questions. There's no longer a thematic essay, and there's no longer a DBQ essay. But they've replaced those with different aspects. So all of these, including the multiple choice, the constructed, the CRQs that are mentioned in this report, all of these are based on documents. Every multiple choice question has a document or a stimulus with it. And when I say document, a lot of people think it's like a written document. Sometimes they're paragraphs, sometimes they're pictures, sometimes, so it's just a stimulus that the kid is going to look at and answer the 1, 2, or 3 questions that go with it. So instead of 50 multiple choice rote questions that we're all used to, they'll now have 28, 30 multiple choice that are based on stimulus. And then they'll have a set of documents in which they answer a question, answer another question, and a third question where you're doing a comparison between those documents. And then there's finally an enduring issue, which I've listed a number of enduring issues, but essentially it's an issue that is not solved and it goes over time. That essay, a kid will get 7 documents and they need to find an enduring issue between 3 or 4 of those documents. And it, as much as this quick overview, it might sound confusing, it really isn't, because I've added to in here somewhere where New York State will accept a number of enduring issues. So as long as the students are exposed to it and see these enduring issues, they'll be able to equate to those enduring issues. So it's a challenge, but I don't see it as anything we can't overcome.
When you look at history too, I wonder, are they hearing it from multiple perspectives? Because we know that while history doesn't change based on the documentation of history, and who has the ability to control that documentation, there's different perspectives. I mean, Howard Zinn's perspective on American history is dramatically different when we look at labor, for example, in the United States than a typical textbook. So I'm wondering, are they getting multiple perspectives in history to appreciate that idea of here's how somebody sees it and here's how somebody sees it?
As a matter of fact, we used to, years ago, we used it as in textbook, and now it's used as a comparison textbook.
Oh, is it?
Yeah,
Okay.
so yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that. So we do show that comparison. I've got a list there. That's this past global enduring issue. New York State allowed that many bullets of enduring issues. They're the same document. There's 5 documents, and the kids had to get, pick 3 and fit it into one of these categories. So you can see it's not just one answer. I mean, there's a series of, you could take those documents and align them to those enduring issues. And it's pretty common sense, especially once they get an exposure to it. And probably most of the higher level students here don't have that exposure because we haven't been tested to that. So we've been following DBQs and thematics. So what you've got now are middle school students that are exposed to this. You've got 9th grade students that are getting exposure to this because next year they will take this exam and they'll have that practice of the enduring issue. And again, the content doesn't change. It's more of just the process in which they've got to show that they know that content. Civic readiness is a state push as well. I know we do have a board member as well as myself that we're on the state committee to start in this in a positive light. So there across the state we were meeting with various schools to come up with what you do to encourage more civic participation in students. There are some, I guess they're preliminary, but it may be, the last I heard was that, and Peter probably has more information because your group met recently, was that the push would be for some sort of certificate on the diploma at some point, that you would start with. You would have that civic participation, you'd keep track of it as the students moved up.
Yeah.
Which is not a push for us at all because, again, to quantify that information, I know we do that K through 12. There's a number of things that we could delineate into those areas.
And I think what's really key is you kind of your next slide down, when you look at this, and what's really interesting about this, this is why when we talk about assessment, and you're talking about these experiences, we have to look at this. So we're talking about civic knowledge, which is content, how we traditionally think about content. But then we talk about civic skills and action. So those are very specific skills. Leading a group, expressing a point, making an argument, calling people. I mean, there's that. Then there's the whole notion of civic mindsets, which is really about attitudes and perspective. Because you can look at anything from the concept of efficacy to understanding my rights and responsibilities as a citizen, and having that mindset that I need to be involved in my community and take responsibility for leadership, and then civic experiences. And what I like about how they frame this is it's really looking at it's looking at students developmentally holistic. It's not just focusing on the content, and it's also this idea of how do we shape experience. Experience is a very dynamic teacher of young people. It's not just sitting in the classroom. I mean, a lot of our students can talk. We've got a student right there that can talk about what she's learned about being a student athlete. I mean, you learn a lot about leadership, and the thing is, how can we take what our student leaders are doing, whether it's drama club, whether it's sports, whether it's the science clubs that we're doing things, how do we take those lessons, get students to reflect on that and express that, in some way. I mean, right now, I talked to Mary Ellen about e-portfolios, and she said basically colleges won't look at them. So,
At this point, right?
At this point, but I do think that if, I think long range, we have to start thinking about how we're going to look at student achievement and accomplishments and development in a different format than traditional grade point averages, SAT scores. And they're talking about getting rid of the SAT scores. And I think, and quite honestly, I mean, look at all the students we've had, and look at Hannah. I mean, these guys are great, and they're great because all the things they do and what they've got out of that experience. If we don't value that, if we don't find a way to assess it, characterize it, and to document it, they're not going to have that same appreciation. We really want to encourage that. But I think that's a great thing about Burn Hills. That's our strength. Our strength is what you guys have built on for years, is the whole notion of engagement with all the participation in sports. I mean, how many of our students are in sports or clubs or music or whatever?
Right.
That's incredible, and that's what makes us a strong school system. But we need to make note of that. I hate to ever get down to a budget and talk about cutting these things, because that is really makes such a difference.
And I can say that the group that I was working with, one of the key aspects was the fact that it should be a little more than traditionally what you had in participation in government, which is, go to a town meeting or go to a board meeting. Not necessarily participate in a board meeting, that's a little different, but to actually just be in there and, sign off, and that generally will get you credit now, and that was one of the mindsets was let's make that a little more than just attending. It's, have some experience, have something, organize something possibly, so
Exactly.
to get yourself more involved. So that's ongoing. I do have alignment where we've had teachers over the summer have aligned civic participation into the lessons that we currently use. So again, that's more data that we can use to know if we're hitting the marks. I showed these threats. That is, again, the change of the regents, the old multiple choice on the left and then the newer one on the right. There's still multiple choice questions, but there's a stimulus there that goes with it. And you need to be able to, it's more than just picking, let's say, a date off the document. You have to know the background of it. And I'll give you a quiz on that later to make sure everybody gets it right. The US also has some changes. Their multiple choice questions will also change. We'll have a stimulus. That occurs next year, not this year as well. They'll have their CRQs. And again, I showed an example here where you've got 3 documents. You got the first 2, and then on 2 documents, and then you've got 3 questions. That third question is comparing those 2 documents. So you answer each one, and then you get to this third question where you're doing a little comparison and you know the relationship between those 2 documents. And during issues, again, that's the essay, that the process, I believe, once our students get used to that, it won't be a shock. It would be for current students somewhat, because they just haven't had that preparation because they haven't needed it. We were teaching to what it is currently. And US will also have a civic literacy essay rather than a document-based essay. So, and I showed you an example there. So, essentially, the changes, although it may be overwhelming if you look at this, it's not when, if you've been having a process to follow, which we have over the past few years, and a transitional process. I can speak to Schenectady City Schools, who took the new regents last year, which you can make that choice, and we as a district decided to take the old one until it ran out, because our kids were already in that process. Schenectady chose to just jump in. I don't know how they prepared their students or how well they did, but I do know that their overall passing percentage went up 19 percentage points in Schenectady. So I say Schenectady like that, I don't mean to. But the idea is the student body, I don't think has the same experience that you possibly have here. It will be interesting to see what happens when next year we take that new exam. Not to say that that first rollout couldn't have had some easier aspects to it, because it was their first rollout, and maybe that's why that percentage was so high. But other schools in the capital region have all reported there's been an increase in their passing scores. So that is my expectation, that we'll see a shift in the passing percentages, because we're relative around the 85% range for global, and it's well over 90% for US. So which is higher level in the capital region. And I can speak to, if there's one thing I guess that I would tout as a strength of mine, and that is I do have a number of connections and a number of experiences with numerous districts around the capital region for years. So that discussion is important for us, so that we're knowing, I can tell you what they're doing in Shen, I can tell you what they're doing in Saratoga and St. Ballston Spa and around the capital region. So anything that changes or occurs, generally I have an inside window to. So hopefully that transitions to success in the future. So it's a larger document. Essentially, if you want to boil it down, we've got some test changes, the content's the same. We arrange our lessons, we show the kids, we expose them to it, and we continue on. Any questions? I got one little, I don't even know if she'll show the video. I'll try and show this video. Any questions, burning questions? I'll end on a happy note. If this works, this was, well, I'll let this lady, hopefully I can make this bigger. But I don't know if you were familiar with the news, Royal Air Force veteran, she turned 100 and dropped a puck up in one of the Adirondack games.
Yeah.
We actually have a part in that. You'll hear, hopefully you can hear it, and if you can, I'll let you know what. Let's see if it's...
Julie, I have something else for you. Okay, we have some friends that we wanted to share your birthday with, and I want to let you know that I reached out to one of the middle schools, and there's a teacher in Burnsville Middle School. His name is Carmen Corvo, and he teaches history.
Anyway, it's a
And
hard
he had
essentially, that's 300 birthday cards
send you some
for
birthday
that
cards
woman
with
that had Warwick Middle School.
480 birthday
We had a
cards. All celebrating
really, with the sound, it's
Oh my goodness. Yes, so there's 7th and 8th graders that go for you. I'll put the clock back over there and we'll get it.
because that was, it's a nice little video, makes you feel good. So I thank you for taking the time.
Questions, from the board? Questions, comments? None? Huh?
Clear.
You got off easy tonight, man. It's usually a pretty talkative board. They're usually grilling people for quite a while, so. Good. Thanks so much for coming, John.
Let me
Yeah, thanks for
clear
putting this
this out.
together.
Thanks for doing a great job on your question.
Yeah, because it is good.
To the consent agenda, for those that don't have it in front of them, we will be approving the minutes of the February 5th, 2020 regular meeting of the Board of Education. We'll be approving some personnel changes in the financials. We'll consider approval of a contract for health and welfare services to resident pupils attending schools out of district. We'll consider approving a resolution to approve the nomination of Naomi Hoffman by the Shenandoah Superintendent Oliver Robinson for the open BOCES board seat. Consider approving the disposal of surplus vehicle. I think Chris had some comments on that. And consideration of approval of the recommendations from the Committee on Special Education. Motion?
Second.
All right, I honestly don't do that. I think Dave and Lisa, I think we're 1 and 2. All right, Chris or Dave, anything you guys want to point out first before we open up to questions?
Just wanted, if interesting little side note, we want to talk about history. We had the social studies program review today. The bus you're approving for disposal is bus number 100. And one of the rules of the state education department is as you buy new buses, they are sequential in your numbering. So the first bus you buy is bus 1, bus 2. We're currently into the high 300s for our current school buses. So when you see bus 100, you'll notice it's a 1972 International. It is a bus that has been parked, and Joe Zub may, even before we sell it, he may take it as a personal challenge to get the engine running on it, but it is parked on our transportation facility, and it has been used as parts storage since 1992. All right, he is proud of that bus. He's a little older than I am, and it is the bus he took to and from school when he was a student here at Burnt Hills, Ballston Lake. So I think it's an interesting note that as our capital project, the 2018 referendum approaches, we will no longer need to have a 1972 bus parked outside for bus storage. We will have the storage in the transportation facility that's coming. There may be some disappointment. There is a legend among the Stevens students, which was shared by my 2 children, Tara knows, as they were going through Stevens, that there are kind of some shades and curtains on the side of the bus. So they've always referred to this bus as the haunted bus. So there may be some sadness that the haunted bus is no more, but I'm sure another tradition will replace it. So just a little bit of a light moment on the history of the passing of bus 100, the haunted bus, as we transition to one of the phases of our 2018 referendum.
On a side note, it'll never disappear because we have it in the video for the capital project, so we'll always have it.
Very good. So that's my only comment tonight. I thought I'd, since you couldn't get a heart-tugging video, I thought I'd end on a light note, at least with the disposal of a vehicle. So,
Very good.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. All right, any questions, comments from the board? If not, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. We have any privilege of the floor, Dottie? I didn't see anything on that. Nothing we were. Attendees had signed up tonight. I didn't see anyone come by. Oh, there is, okay. Thank you. Okay, so we do have one person who came out tonight, Ms. Page. You can, let's see, I think we've been having people, Ms. Page.
Yes.
Hi. If you don't mind, we've been having people, even if you want to sit at the table, with this little device here in the center is capturing the video and audio. So this will be captured for the public record if you don't mind. So you can feel free to stand or
Right
take a
now?
seat. Yep, you're up, so you can feel free to take a seat or stand if you like. We give you 5 minutes to address the entire board, typically.
I sit all day. Actually, I don't, but,
You
so
can
I,
stand, and typically you'll get a response within a day to 2. If it's
Okay.
something that warrants a response, any of the questions, you can feel free to follow up to myself or Dr. McGrath.
so I believe myself and other parents behind me and teachers are here because of the concern with the possible section cuts in the new 6th grade that is coming up. I'm an alumni of Burnt Hills. I have an 8th grade daughter who actually has Mr. Antonsky for social studies. And my son Evan is leaving Charlton Heights to come to the middle school. Evan does have an IEP. As an alumni here, I graduated in 1992. We always had pretty small classes, which I think is indicative to who we are. As a school district, I work in an urban environment. I do not work in Schenectady, so I did not take his heartfelt Schenectady to heart. But I do work in a large classroom, and I find that the numbers being as high as they are in my situation where I teach, it makes it very difficult for me as an educator to check for understanding, that CFU, to walk around and make sure that any of the misunderstandings or mistakes my students are making are covered within that time frame of the content that I'm teaching. I would hate to see the middle school, the 6th grade especially, as an intermediate, kind of like a coming in introduction to middle school, have sections cut, creating larger class sizes. I know for my son in particular, it would be fairly devastating to him because he does require more attention due to his lack of organization, ADHD and whatnot. My daughter is a straight A student, plays lots of sports, and she struggled coming into 6th grade as a well-adjusted, ready to go 5th to 6th grade transition, and it was a lot for her. So I'm just I realize it's budget, I realize it's money, I realize it's a lot more than just, me standing up here as a mom and a teacher and an alumni saying, really try hard, but I'm gonna ask you to really try hard to figure out a way not to do that, because I think it is detrimental to our community and who we are as a district to keep those class sizes smaller and more intimate, so teachers can do their job appropriately within their time frame.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks for coming out. All right, so that was all we had there for privilege of the floor. So we're going to move right to discussion items, and I think we'll probably be starting with you again, Chris, to recap the budget update in the Finance Committee meeting. We did have a 6 o'clock meeting here for those of us that got out even earlier than 7 o'clock with a Finance Committee update predominantly from Drs. Abadou and McGrath. So